The Gibraltar Strait was the point of connection between cultures in the Middle Ages, and that's what we're talking about today. Hello and welcome to the Medieval Grad Podcast. It's a podcast brought to you by medievalists.net, where we chat with graduate students and early career researchers to learn about the new trends and the future of research in medieval studies. I'm Lucie Laumonier, a medieval historian and the podcast host. And today we are talking with Emma Snowden, who defended her dissertation in history at the University of Minnesota in June 2021. Emma is now a visiting assistant professor at Hollins University. Hello, Emma. Thank you very much for being here.
Hi, Lucie. Thank you so much for having me.
For a start, Emma, tell us what brought you to studying the Middle Ages.
Yeah, so I wasn't actually very interested in the Middle Ages until college. I went on a trip to Spain with my mom, and we went to Granada and saw the Alhambra, and it just really wowed me, getting to see that mix of Muslim and Christian architectural styles. And I didn't really know much about the history of Al-Andalus up to that point, and I had never heard about it in a classroom at all. But my interest was definitely piqued. And so I ended up taking a couple of medieval history classes after that. And fortuitously enough, they were with a professor who specializes in medieval Iberia and North Africa. So I was really able to learn more about that. And I think it was a topic that I was particularly interested in because I've been learning Spanish since I was a kid. I attended a dual language school from kindergarten through the 8th grade. So I felt like, okay, well, I already have one of the research languages. I felt sort of an affinity for it. And also because of my experience at that dual language school, I think I was really interested in sort of the dynamics of multilingual communities and multicultural communities. So studying Al-Andalus simultaneously felt like brand new. It was something I hadn't heard of, but it was also related to a lot of topics that I was really interested in. So it just kind of fell into place. And so Al-Andalus is a term that was used to refer to Muslim Spain throughout the Middle Ages. It was ruled by different dynasties at different points and, sort of took different forms at different points and had different borders depending on the time period. But it's a general phrase used to refer to Muslim Spain.
So, Emma, your dissertation's title was or is Bridging the Strait, the Shared History of Iberia and North Africa in Medieval Muslim and Christian Chronicles. And I really find this title very poetic, because you're featuring the Gibraltar Strait in such a central way. And it reminds me of Fernand Broddel's work on the Mediterranean that really placed geography at the departure point of a longue durée research, which means a research on a long time span. And your own research also covers a long period of time stretching from the 8th century to the 14th century. So before delving into the specifics, could you give us the gist of your work? What was its starting point? Why the Gibraltar Strait? What did you want to look at and what did you hope to find out?
So as an undergrad, sort of getting into Al-Andalus, one of the first things that really fascinated me and sort of made me want to pursue my own research was reading different accounts of the 8th century Islamic conquests of Iberia. And so these are the conquests that led to the establishment of Al-Andalus and the fall of the Christian Visigothic monarchy. And so one of the earliest local accounts that we have for these conquests was written by a Christian living in Al-Andalus. He wrote in Latin. And he basically says that the last Visigothic king, Rhetoric, gained the throne through rebellion. And so in the course of this rebellion, he really destabilized things politically, which in turn, allowed for the Muslim conquerors when they arrived to sort of have a lot more success than they might have otherwise. But about a century later, you start to get Arabic accounts written by Muslims living in Al-Andalus and Egypt that also focus on Rhetoric's role in the fall of Spain, but a lot more colorfully and a lot more memorably. So there are a couple of major stories sort of attached to Rhetoric. One of them is that in the Visigothic capital of Toledo, there was this locked building where every Visigothic king, when he ascended the throne, was supposed to put his own lock, and no one ever opened the building. No one knew what was inside. But when Rhetoric became king, we already know he's kind of a rebel. He decided, I want to know what's inside. I'm going to open it. I'm not going to put my own lock on. He kind of thought that there was treasure inside. And so that was part of what was motivating him, was greed. So when he opened the building and went inside, what he found was this box that was decorated with images of Arab warriors and an inscription warning that whoever opened the box and opened the building was going to bring about the fall of Spain at the hands of these warriors. And so that's what's supposed to have happened. Another story about Rhetoric that, as a warning, is much darker in tone, is that he raped the daughter of one of his noblemen, Julian. And so in retaliation for this, and in order to avenge his daughter, Julian ended up crossing the strait and going to Muslim leaders in North Africa and offering to guide them in an invasion and conquest of Spain. And so these are some stories about Rhetoric that are really wildly popular in the Arabic tradition and throughout the Islamic world at the time. And these stories were actually so popular that they ended up getting translated into Christian histories at a certain point, into Christian chronicles. And so I find a number of things interesting about this. Obviously, the translation itself, and also the Christian chroniclers who, at the time, were really sort of advocating for the revival of the Visigothic order, a return to Iberia as it was before Islam, were adopting these narratives from Muslims that were like maligning, the last Visigothic king. And another thing I find interesting about the story of Julian and his daughter, and which gets more to your point about, why the Strait of Gibraltar is the focus for my project, is that these chronicles sort of turned to the story as a way to explain how Muslims could have possibly crossed the strait, as if it wouldn't have been a fairly easy thing to do. So, for example, one Arabic chronicle written by a Muslim living in Al-Andalus in the 10th century says that at first, people in Spain didn't even notice the arrival of the Muslim conquerors because they were so used to seeing ships going back and forth across the strait, commercial ships. It was a very common sight. And this makes sense that there would have been a lot of connectivity because the Strait of Gibraltar is very narrow. In some places, you can see one shore from another as long as it's a clear day. But that same chronicle sort of makes it out like Muslims couldn't have possibly managed crossing the strait without Christian help, without their man on the inside, Julian. And so I think there's sort of this tension between the strait as both a bridge and a border between Iberia and North Africa. And you see that sort of symbolism and that tension continuing on in chronicles throughout the Middle Ages. And so also even today, the Strait of Gibraltar is very much both a bridge and a border between Europe and Africa. Some of Europe's most heavily fortified borders are actually with Africa. So for those reasons, I've really been drawn to this question of connectivity across the strait because I think it pops up a lot in past and present.
So in your work, you look at the strait as a point of connectivity between Iberians and North Africans, as well as between Christians and Muslims, based on the study of Chronicles, which you already mentioned, Chronicles that were written in North Africa, in Al-Andalus, so Muslim Iberia, and in Christian Iberia. Could you talk about these sources and how you analyzed them?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that I define a chronicle is as a mostly chronological narrative written in prose about events in the past. And in all three linguistic traditions, history as a genre, definitely didn't have firm or clear boundaries. There were historical texts written in prose, and texts with a lot of historical information that were organized geographically instead of chronologically. So definitely within respective linguistic traditions, many of these chronicles built on and referenced one another and were often written, as continuations or compilations of earlier texts. And at a certain point, and this is what I find especially fascinating, you clearly have Arabic chronicles drawing on Latin and Spanish chronicles and vice versa. And this was especially the case, with topics of major mutual interest, like the Islamic conquest of Iberia in the 8th century that I talked about. So in analyzing these chronicles, I guess it sounds basic, but I like to start with the content, looking at where there are similarities and differences in what they chose to cover and how they chose to talk about it. And also looking at how often Muslims and Christians on the one hand and Iberians and North Africans on the other hand talked about one another and presented their histories as related or not.
Yeah, so following up on what you just said, you argue in your dissertation, and I quote, that chroniclers on opposite shores of the strait saw their histories as intrinsically connected. So could you elaborate on the way in which they understood and wrote this shared history?
Yes. Iberians and North Africans were both very invested in this question of their historical relationship to one another. But I find that they often approached it in somewhat different ways. One major difference is that Muslims tended to emphasize unity across the strait. And this makes sense, considering that for centuries Muslims ruled on both of its shores, and at various points you have significant portions of Iberia and North Africa under the control of the same Islamic dynasties and empires, like the Almoravid Emirate in the 11th century and the Almohad Caliphate in the 12th century. And I mean, related to this, something I think that is often not highlighted as much by modern scholars as it could or should be, is that in the Middle Ages, North Africans controlled far more territory in Iberia than Iberians ever did in North Africa. So it's not surprising that Muslims, and particularly North Africans, focused on historical connections across the strait to sort of justify and set a precedent for continued unity under Islam. Christian chroniclers, on the other hand, I think tended to view the history of North Africa as closely related to that of Iberia, but they weren't necessarily pushing for unification in the same way, despite some of the obvious precedents for Christian unity, like under the Roman and Byzantine empires. Instead, what Christian chroniclers often tended to do was to kind of collapse the religious and ethnocultural identities of Muslims in Iberia. So they would emphasize their North African origins and sort of imply that in order to set things right and restore the divine order, Muslims should leave Iberia and, go back to North Africa. And of course, this kind of rhetoric ignored, among lots of other things, the fact that many Iberian Muslims were actually descended from Christians who had lived in the peninsula before the conquests, and who had converted, to Islam in the intervening centuries. So overall, I would say that Christian chroniclers tended to focus on unity within the peninsula and on what they considered, returning Muslims to North Africa, whereas Muslims were interested in more fully unifying Iberia and North Africa under Islamic rule. And to this end, actually, you even see some chroniclers suggesting that North Africans had immigrated to Iberia before the Spanish and the Romans and the Visigoths, and that God had favored them when they did this. So I think this is an example where you can see chroniclers trying to sort of establish new precedents for the presence of North Africans in Iberia, and give them claims to occupancy that predated those of Christians, which I just find super interesting.
Yeah, it is. And how did these chronicles describe their differences and the differences among their populations?
Yeah, so even on kind of the micro level of the vocabulary that they used to describe one another, you get a lot of othering, a lot of derogatory terms being thrown around for sure. When Muslim and Christian chroniclers did use religious terminology to refer to one another, they tended not to use the words that Muslims and Christians used for themselves. They used demeaning terms like pagans, infidels, polytheists. And actually, two of the most common terms that Christians use for Muslims, Saracen and Moor, but both of these terms and their histories sort of give a good sense of some of the ways that Christians conceptualized and othered Muslims, so I think they're worth talking about. So the term Saracen is a reference to Sarah, the wife of the scriptural patriarch Abraham. And even though Muslims consider themselves to be descended from Ishmael, Abraham's son with another woman, Hagar, the term Saracen was used by Christians to imply that Muslims were lying about their heritage and claiming descent through Isaac, Abraham's legitimate son with Sarah. So it's very demeaning in that sense, and also just very inaccurate. And the word Moor, on the other hand, comes from the Latin Mauri, which used to refer to people from the Roman province of Mauritania. And it was very common in the Middle Ages, and it was actually very broadly applied to Muslims, sort of regardless of their geographical origins. And that's part of what I mean about this collapsing of religious and ethnocultural identities and sort of a lumping together of all Muslims into this undifferentiated category of North African. And also, Christians weren't entirely alone in this either. Muslims also tended to use terms for Iberian Christians that were geographically based, but just incorrect. So they would often refer to Christian Iberians, for instance, as Ifranj, which means Franks, or Rum, which means Romans. So yeah, even as Muslims and Christians were really working to highlight their differences from one another, they used fairly similar strategies to do so, which I find kind of striking.
What about the Jewish population? Because there were a lot of Jews in Iberia at that time.
There were, yeah. With Jews, you actually do find it much more common that they would be referred to in Muslim and Christian chronicles specifically as Jews, which I actually hadn't thought about that before, because I will admit that, something my project does not really do that much is incorporate Jewish histories and Jewish perspectives. But that, yeah, they do, I think, tend to refer to them more specifically by name. There was a huge diversity of Jewish views on being in Al-Andalus or Christian Iberia or North Africa, but you certainly have something kind of similar, I think, in Jewish communities in Spain as what you have in some Christian communities in Spain after the Islamic conquest. You have some people sort of mourning the fact that their culture has become so Arabized, and that their youth and their communities speak Arabic so fluently, but maybe not Hebrew, maybe not Latin anymore. But then you also have some people just really celebrating that and being like, we can be just as Jewish in Arabic, we can be just as Christian in Arabic. So I think you see actually some fairly similar tensions within communities about, what does this mean for our religious identity when we've really assimilated so much linguistically and culturally.
I have another question, which is based on the introduction of your dissertation you sent, and you mentioned that you devote a chapter to women and gender across the strait. So how were women featured in Chronicles, and what were their roles, or whether, real roles or the kind of narrative roles they were assigned?
Despite a lot of what I would call misconceptions in both popular and scholarly ideas about women in medieval Islam, I find that women are mentioned with pretty similar frequency and in fairly similar ways in chronicles written by Muslims and Christians across the Strait. I mean, at heart, these chronicles were interested in the question of the exercise of power, right? Whether it was by men or by women. So when they do talk about women, it's often in that context of them exercising power. So it's a good way to sort of examine that question, actually, of the relationship between gender and power, I think. And so without kind of ignoring that there were some real differences in the ways that Muslim and Christian communities conceived of gender and structured political power, I think in these chronicles you see women exercising power in very similar ways. So even though, for example, women ruled in their own right and in their own name much more often in Christian communities in this region, both Muslim and Christian women were portrayed as really essential and critical advisors to men and their families on whether they were husbands, sons, brothers, nephews, kind of whatever. One difference I find is that Muslim women from North Africa were more likely to be portrayed as warriors who participated directly in military action. And this was true of chroniclers from both religious traditions, actually, and both sides of the strait. So even though we have these sort of stereotypes that Muslim women in the Middle Ages were supposed to be sort of secluded, especially elite women were supposed to remain in the private sphere, a lot of Muslim chroniclers actually mention them actively participating in political and military endeavors, and they don't seem to find anything very out of the ordinary about this. They tended to judge these women by whether their actions were good or bad for the community at large, but not as much for whether their actions were gender appropriate. And the same was true of Christian women.
So, Emma, I have a final question before the concluding question. And this question is about colonization. I was wondering if the chronicles used sort of a rhetoric of colonization, and if yes, how?
Yes, I find that they absolutely did. And interestingly, in the scholarship, I think colonialism in the Middle Ages is something that's often acknowledged much more in the case of European states and in the case of Christian states. But you don't see the same being done for a lot of the North African states that, as I mentioned, had a huge presence in Iberia, like the Almoravids and the Almohads. And so I do think it can be really useful to understand them as colonial powers and to look at some of the aspects of the chronicles produced under these dynasties as colonizing in their rhetoric and in sort of their narrative strategies. Absolutely. And so there's been a lot of sort of pushback against the idea of Reconquista. in scholarship recently, and I think justifiably, because it stems from sort of this attempt to trace a Spanish Christian national heritage, that wasn't related to the presence of Muslims and Jews in the peninsula. And it also is often presented as sort of, the dominant ideology in Iberia, this idea that Muslims needed to be removed from the peninsula. And of course, that was never a monolithic perspective. But that being said, I think when you read a lot of these chronicles, you can really understand where a lot of the support for the idea of Reconquista came from. They are talking about expelling Muslims. They really are. And I do find that to be very colonial. But something that I find really interesting is that you start to see in sort of the Central Middle Ages and later Middle Ages, you start to see Muslim chronicles, first in Iberia and then in North Africa, kind of adopting this same rhetoric that you could call Reconquista, this idea that they wanted to expel Christians, and using sort of the same narrative strategies and using it against them and sort of appropriating it and turning it on its head. So yeah, I very much think that it can be useful to read these chronicles with like a colonial and post-colonial lens.
And so to conclude, I like to ask the show's guests a light question. What advice would you give to a prospective grad student? I'm assuming someone would like to, investigate the Mediterranean, North Africa, Iberia.
Yeah, well, someone who's interested in the Mediterranean specifically, I would say, take any opportunity you can to go there. Use the opportunity to travel. Like, I think it's one of the best things about academia and sort of specifically about your time as a grad student is I think there's more funding and more time to just do that travel and go to archives. So I know that, after our pandemic year, it's maybe a little harder to imagine than it was before, but hopefully in the future that kind of thing will be easier to do again. And so I would encourage everyone to take the opportunity if they get one.
Yeah, I agree. It's great when you're studying something to just go somewhere and you can think about the people who were there.
Yeah.
I think it's very emotional sometimes, like to just touch the stones and
Yes. Yeah, no, I wrote part of the first chapter that I drafted, like I was doing it as I was sitting in Tangier on a rooftop, like looking at the shore of Spain, so when I say like you can see it, like I know that you can see it. So yeah, obviously not every aspect of being a grad student can be that romantic, but sometimes it's really nice, and those are some of those moments.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Emma. It was really great.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was wonderful to talk to you.
That was Emma Snowden, a visiting assistant professor at Hollins University. You can find out more about her in the show notes. Stay with us because the episode isn't over yet. Let's bring in Peter Konieczny from medievalist.net. Hi, Peter. How are you? What did you think of the interview?
I'm doing good, and it's good to see a person working on Chronicles. It's the kind of what I say meat and potatoes of the medieval historian community. So,
True.
It was to me very fascinating first to see how these chronicles are working with each other,
Yeah.
and I guess we don't kind of take into consideration that like one chronicle is working and writing and another one's reacting to it, right? So they're
Yes.
kind of taking the same story and putting it through that. Also, like, I kind of found it really fascinating, like the details you can get in Chronicles. I love looking at Chronicles. Just it was one of those like that came out to me was when she mentioned that there's so much traffic crossing Gibraltar that they couldn't even realize there was an invasion going on just because there's so many already ships coming along. It didn't really make a big difference. So yeah, so these were all kind of like fascinating tidbits, and yeah, I was really enjoying it.
Yeah, I love Chronicles too. And I think what I like the most, as you said, is this kind of little, very, day to day, very basic details that really bring us back to a period of time. And when they talk about, I like stuff about the weather, the little things that make the Chronicles more personal or that really speak to the individuals, not just the events, the big story.
Mhm. It's funny how these chronicles expand, and like when we kind of like she kind of mentions the early ones with Rodrigo, it doesn't have too much information, but within a century,
Yeah.
this story kind of blossoms out. It's hard to tell the historicity of all of that, but that's the kind of work she has to do. So kind of figuring out like where are people going and like where are they getting their details. But that was I was always really enjoying that quite a bit.
Yes, and I also found very interesting the focus on the geographical area, because of course, like I'm thinking, when I'm teaching medieval history, I will talk about the Gibraltar Strait, especially in
Mhm.
terms of economic history. But oftentimes we separate so much the history of Europe, the history of North Africa. Maybe not when you're a historian of medieval Iberia, but you in general,
Mhm.
while it was actually such an important hub and point of connection between cultures and societies.
Yeah, like I think one thing we kind of forget is that in the Middle Ages, like a place to Gibraltar, the Gibraltar Straits is it's more of a bridge than a barrier,
Yeah.
right? Like it's become, in like the last century or two, more like this kind of barrier between lands. But in the Middle Ages, when sea traffic was the best way of doing things.
So yeah, it was really a great episode, and I I loved the fact that she talked about being there, looking at the other shore. It's so important to immerse yourself in what you're studying when you have the financial means and the opportunities to travel to these places. It's incredible.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think if you are a graduate student, it's so ideal if you can, be at the places described. So, and of course, living in Europe is always
Oh
pretty good.
yeah.
That says us Canadians, right, in the middle of winter.
There's still so much snow outside. All right. Any reading recommendations on the website?
Yeah, we linked to an article. It's just, if you want to know more, it's called like "Images of Rodrigo: The Construction of Past and Present in Late Medieval Iberian Chronicles" by a person named Angus Ward. We have it's on like another online journal, but you can we have did a connection to it a long time ago, so I'll just pass that along in the show notes.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thanks.
You were listening to the Medieval Grad Podcast, brought to you by medievalists.net. If you want to support us and to support this podcast, you can subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/medievalists. You can get a lot of neat benefits on Patreon, including being able to hear these episodes early. We love doing the show and we really appreciate your help. I'm Lucie Laumonier. You can find me on Instagram @TheFrenchMedievalist, and you can look me up on academia.edu. Thank you very much for tuning in. Goodbye. Au revoir.